I'm going to switch over now to the PowerPoint, and I'll talk a little bit about the format, the pedagogy, how I'm organizing this course, and ways of interacting given the size and the online modality. So this is the anxiety producing part for me, where I share my screen for the first time. Could somebody give me a thumbs up or a note in the chat? Okay, excellent. So that's the hardest part for me. Yeah, great. So this is how the workshop is going to be organized. Yeah, thank you very much. So there's a couple of principles that I try to use when I teach methods. This is a little bit different depending on the topic, whether it's computational methods or ethnography. But here are the principles that I'm going to use to sort of organize this workshop. So the first thing is to start with recognizing variation. And what I mean by this is people are coming to this workshop with various backgrounds and different research methodologies, different disciplines, different research contexts. So if you're writing for a sociology audience and sociology journals, that's slightly different than health policy. That's different from industry. And there's also different sets of use cases that is kind of like the jargony term for reasons why we might use in-depth interviews. And so one thing I really try to do is not be preachy and say interviews need to do this, but talk about the ways that you could deploy them for your own projects. So that's, and if you have a case and like that doesn't really make sense for what I'm doing, what about this? I'm happy to have that discussion. So I move from that to some fundamental ideas and concepts about what interviews are, how they sort of fit into the pantheon of methods. I'm going to talk a lot about successful practices. So this is going to be less about the theory of interviews as a methodology, how that compares to survey research or participant observation, and more like, here are the things you actually need to do when you are conducting, designing, and analyzing interviews. I'm also going to I am going to situate this over the life course of a project. So we're going to go basically through sequences where we start with design, we go to execution, where you are doing interviews or you have research assistants doing interviews, and then analyzing and writing. So it's, in a sense, is going to be roughly chronological. And the other thing is I'm going to try throughout, or not try, will connect this to real world applications. And I've also, in addition to using interviews in a lot of my own projects, both with teams and individually, worked on other projects and consulted in a whole host of contexts. So again, very happy to answer questions. Everything will be uploaded to the Dropbox. I will continue to post that link in the chat. And one request that I have is for questions, just given that there's a number of different people from different places. Some people are attending asynchronously. As questions come up, please feel free to just type those into the chat, and then when there is a pause, then I'll sort of go through and try to connect those. But if you have a longer, nuanced, specific question about what about this project and it has these unique characteristics, please also connect on the Slack, and I'm happy to answer those questions. I might write too much in reply because I tend to nerd out on these things. And so, yeah, and if I miss a question, it's not because I don't like your question or I'm trying to, slight you. It's just there's a lot of stuff going on. And then please just feel free to follow up in chat. Okay. So this course is organized into 4 different modules. The first, which is going to cover a lot of the sort of background material, some of the language that you'll need to, be able to deploy in fielding and justifying an interview study. And I don't mean justifying like, well, why would we have to, but any method you use, you have to explain why you're using it. And each of the methods has like a slightly different language. So in-depth interviews are going to use a slightly different language than survey research, a slightly different language than participant observation. And I'm going to try to introduce some of that. I'm going to talk about ways that interviews have been used in the social sciences, in policy, and also in, I guess, industry and other applications. I'm going to talk about cases and sampling, which is a really interesting question. For me, that's one of the hardest parts of in-depth interviews is deciding who to interview. And so I'm going to give you some suggestions on that. And then we're going to talk a bit about recruiting strategies and designing and refining an interview guide, which is a really important part of fielding an interview study is, having a way to connect what you're trying to understand to concrete questions that you're going to ask and that you're going to integrate in interactions with your research subjects. Then we're going to move on to conducting interviews. And here I'm going to walk through a lot of the really kind of nuts and bolts of doing this. And so I'm going to walk through, and I think for this part especially, even if you're a sort of seasoned interviewer, there will probably be things that will be useful here to deploy in your own study. So I'm going to talk about pre-interview preparations. I'm going to talk about technology. There's all sorts of new tech out there. We're not going to get into so much like here are all the ways you might combine this with computational methods, but things like, are there best practices for recording and keeping track of what you're doing as you're talking to people? And there's a lot of things people don't think of until you have a recorder die and then you lose an interview that you could never get back. And I say these things because they've happened to me, and I try to help others in avoiding some of this stuff. We'll also go through and do a simulated interview. So I'm going to have somebody come in. They're not a social scientist or a researcher. I haven't, extensively prepped them. And we're going to sort of go through and sort of show what some of this looks like in interactions. And then we are going to go on to the post-interview debrief. And so for me, there's the design, there's the run up to the interview, and then after each interview, there's a process that I go through to make sure that I have the information that I'm going to need to write up my study, or at least that sort of initial part. So we're going to talk about producing a post-interview memo where we write up some of our initial thoughts, and then that's going to connect to later analyses. And then the third major phase, or third major module, is going to focus on organizing, analyzing, and writing interviews. So this is going to have maybe a little bit of overlap with something like qualitative data analysis, but this is going to be a much more general, in a sense, like it's not dependent on using particular software, but also more specific in that it's focusing on the workflow of in-depth interviews and some of the practices that we have there with respect to connecting memos, which are really kind of your reflections and writings on the data that you're producing, the issue of transcription and what that would look like. I've always kind of shied away from saying things like best practices, in part because the best practice for a method is going to depend on a number of things, including how you're using it. So an exploratory study that is a pilot for a survey is going to have different best practices than a large funded team-based interview study. But when we start getting to things like transcription and file organization, I've started to, I guess, change my position on that and say there really are ways that are much more efficient in organizing information that work for both small studies and large studies. And I'm going to give you some of those and lots of templates. We're going to talk about how to identify patterns and themes in your data. So that's another one of the tricky parts of in-depth interviews, but there are things you could do to make it, both still insightful, but also less tricky. And then I'm going to talk a bit about connecting these memos and data sets. So that's going to be the main phase. And then for module 4, part 4, this is going to be more connecting the parts. So this is going to be on the final day. It's probably going to be shorter because my idea is a lot of this is going to come up throughout the workshop. So one thing will be any sort of questions or challenges that come up. And again, I will try to answer those as they occur. And then I'm also going to try to connect back to some other issues of broad interest, like using interviews and mixed methods research. That's something that I'm going to talk about throughout. In part, that's something that I often do, and interviews are great in part because not only are they useful as a standalone method, they combine really well with a lot of other methods. So that's one of the real sort of points of potential. I'm going to talk a bit about team-based interview studies. So for those of you that are doing that, I'm going to give examples throughout and then return to that. Multi-participant issues. So if you're interviewing, say, dyads of people, say, an older adult living with dementia and their caregiver, then sometimes we do those in groups, and there's a few kind of small tweaks to that. Focus groups and remote interviewing, I'm also going to sort of talk about throughout, because that's kind of, it's both reality and a bit of a hot topic in methodology. So whether you use remote interviews over Zoom or you only do in person, you might get asked about why you didn't do the other thing. At least in science, that's sort of like you always get asked about what you didn't do, and that's something to think through. Okay. All right. So part 1, designing an interview study. I felt like that sounded more audiobook than I meant it to be, but yeah. So this is really, there's, I want to say both design and execution are really important for any methodology. So a good design doesn't guarantee good execution, and good execution could sometimes compensate for bad design, but ideally you want to have sort of both. And design is particularly important at the level of not just justifying what you're doing for publication, but also if you are going through and trying to get funding and things like that. So, and there are going to be some important differences. So for those who have, a largely quantitative background, I have a quantitative background as well, so I'm very comfortable answering questions there. There's, I want to say, a bit more flexibility that is kind of expected in qualitative studies, particularly interview-based studies, in part because you're paying attention to things that you didn't expect, findings that emerge, so to speak. And I'm going to talk about how that is sort of integrated. But before we get into that, on a very basic level, I always try to start with definitions. And so, you might ask, or you might get asked, well, what is an in-depth interview? And here, there's a recent review in Science that talks about this. basically, an in-depth interview is where somebody asks questions and a respondent answers. Now, that could be true for something like a survey, right? If you do a telephone survey, you ask questions and people give set responses. But qualitative interviews differ in a couple of ways. So first, in general, while we sometimes have closed-ended questions, especially around things like demographics, or if you are in health or medicine, you might have some diagnostic measures like, GAD-7 or PHQ-9, something like that to look at anxiety or depression. For the most part, responses in an in-depth interview are open-ended. So it's not, how would, on, from least to most, like a Likert-like scale or yes, no, really it's about getting people to talk. And part of the trick with this, or one of, I want to say the sort of standard points, is you want this to feel conversational for the person that you're speaking with. But as a researcher, it's never really just a conversation. So the idea is that you're asking questions and getting answers, but you don't want it to feel mechanical because you're going to try to elicit narratives. In practice, an important part of this, and I want to say this is one of the things that people work on for their entire careers, and you could still get better at, as long as you're doing this research, is using follow-up questions. And some of these follow-up questions, I'm going to give examples, are called probes. So I might reasonably expect that if I ask somebody, have you had any instances where, I wouldn't say instances, is anything that you teach controversial? And somebody might say yes, and say, well, could you give me an example? And then they'll give me an example. And then I would say, well, could you tell me more about that? But there's other points where you're going to have follow-ups that are not kind of like pre-planned or expected. And following those threads and doing that effectively is part of what is going to separate, really good in-depth interviews from kind of more, middling. Now, middling in-depth interviews could still produce a lot of really good information. But this is one of the things that also is very different from a survey in that your follow-ups are not necessarily scripted. And then in practice, although there are, some studies that are doing large-scale in-depth interviews, usually the analysis is ultimately going to be of text, right? So what people say, what the content of that is, maybe how that varies within and between groups. But usually, as with most qualitative work, the idea is not to simply reduce this to numbers and run statistical models. So that's kind of one of the core differences between what we call qualitative and quantitative work. So it doesn't mean that if you're in a field that really cares about counts, that you wouldn't say, well, 40 of my 80 interviews, mention this, but ultimately the way your research and your findings are going to be evaluated is not just going to be based on that. And so to give you an example here, I'm going to go through and show what's called a question answer pair from a real world example. This is from my first book, The Endgame, where I ask somebody a question, they respond, and then I sort of follow up just to sort of give you an idea of what that looks like. And you'll see, very quickly how this might be different from even a closed or an open-ended response in a survey. Okay, so this example, and I'm not going to read through all of it, but this is, an interview that I did with someone I'm going to call Charlene. I'm always going to give pseudonyms or IDs, never real names at this point, because that's the, necessitated by both the method and my institutional review boards. Here, I have some demographics just to help contextualize this. The person identified as a white woman. They were in a middle-class area. They had a college education, and they were retired. And this is from a segment of an interview dealing with experiences with growing older. And you'll see that I have, some kind of like, what is INTV_CA? Good question. So this is not how I would include this if I were writing up a study. If I were writing this up, I would say Charlene, pseudonym, a person that identifies as a white woman in a middle-class area, talks about retirement and some of the challenges by noting, and then I'd have the example, and then I'd unpack it. But when we get to what an actual transcript looks like, and the transcript is just the text translation of that audio from the interview, I use identifiers for both all my interviewers. So INTV_CA is interviewer, Corey Abramson. That's my name. If I have a team, I'll do this so I could see who is a person asking the question without having their full name. And OA017 is for older adult, right? So this is older adults, 17, which will show me where they are in that spreadsheet that I'm going to talk about in module 2 of keeping track of everybody. And then when I write it, I'll of course replace that with pseudonyms so it sounds sort of more human, but this is also going to help me in keeping track of all my data. And coming up with conventions like this is really important if you're doing a large team-based project, because otherwise everything turns into a mess. But even if you are, writing a dissertation, which is the big project, even a small exploratory pilot study, having some conventions, for your text formatting is going to be something that's really useful. So going back to the simpler point, right? What does an interview look like? This is an example. So I've already built rapport with this person. I've done, my institutional review board consent, and now we're having what feels like a conversation, but I look at as, it is a conversation, but it is a very particular research situation in which I want the person to feel comfortable. And I'm also trying to understand this topic, experiences with growing older. And so I just kind of picked this one, not because it's the best example, but because it, sort of shows what the flow looks like. So the person had mentioned retirement earlier. And so I follow up and say, can you tell me a little bit about retirement? You said you stay busy. So I'm referencing something you said previously, which both indicates that I am paying attention to what they're saying, which is really important. I'm not just checking off the list, and I'm trying to give them an opportunity to follow up. And the person says, it's growing older is weird. I mean, my mind, I think I'm 35, etc. You notice things when you're a senior, like getting on a bus and not having someone give up a seat. I notice the rudeness of young people. And so I follow up. There's a pause. And I said, is there any example that sticks out in your mind? And I'm going to give you later what I call my kind of on tap questions. So when people say something and it's in a general way, one of the things you often want to do is you want to follow that thread and get them to be, concrete. So you could use that concrete example. The example has value in and of itself, but also their thoughts about it have value. And the other part of this is if you just kind of like ask your questions, a lot of people, there's a subset of people, and this is something we'll talk about as well. You ask me a question on like, what do you think about this methodology? You're going to have to interrupt me because otherwise I'm going to talk for like 30 minutes. And it may or may not be directly related to what you need for your study. And there are people like that, but for a lot of people, it's also like getting them to talk. This person was somewhere in between. And so, I sort of asked this follow-up, And then they give an example of being on the bus and that happening. And when you are analyzing the data, these sort of narratives, accounts, et cetera, are going to be your primary data for an in-depth interview, right? So it's ultimately going to be what people say, how they make sense of things, and text. And we're going to talk a lot about processing the text. And I will say, so this is it's going to be a lot of information, especially for those of you that have not done a lot of interviews before. And so again, I'm happy to follow up, provide more info, and also, there's a lot of stuff to learn. So, be kind to yourself as you're doing it. So I wish sometimes like there's a way to just download like matrix information and methods, but I have not quite figured it out yet. There's a lot of practicing and whatnot. So hopefully this will help you with the learning curve. And even for those of you that have like a lot of experience, hopefully there's some tips and not tricks, but things that you can transpose or use in your own research. So if an in-depth interview is about asking questions and getting answers and having a conversation or what feels like a conversation to produce data that we call qualitative, in that it is text rather than just numbers. And, maybe it looks something like this if it's all typed out from the audio. And I'll talk about transcription, but in general, you want to try to have things transcribed whenever you can. Why would you use in-depth interviews? So, as I said, interviews are often combined with a lot of different methods. So they could be used as a standalone, method. And there's, of course, heated debates about whether you should use surveys or interviews or field methods. I tend to look at this in a much more pragmatic way. Different methods have different uses and values. And so I'm not going to weigh in on this. I'm just going to give you some examples of where people have said in-depth interviews are particularly useful. So one way is to get at people's experiences and how they narrate that. So say if I'm a field researcher, right? So I observe a sequence of behavior, how people deal with a challenging interaction in a medical setting or in a corner store. It's not the same as getting somebody's account of that. And interviews allow you to have people, talking about and explaining their own experiences, which could be really useful for a lot of different questions. They're also very useful for getting at things like life histories. So if I'm doing a survey, I could ask people about, employment and education and income, but how people tie together, how they connect, where they're from to where they are now. That's something that in-depth interviews could provide a lot of insight on. It allows us to look at how people justify decisions. So this is something that, somebody makes a decision to get treatment or not for, a treatable early stage cancer diagnosis, or they decide to pursue one professional route rather than another. Well, after the fact, there's, what they're thinking at the time. That may be a harder thing to get at, but how they explain their decisions is something that interviews could be really powerful at. And those justifications could be really important. They let us also see if we're interested in worldviews, trying to sort of look at how those are presented. They're also great for hard to reach populations. So maybe you're a survey researcher and you're like, I'd really like to talk to this very specific subpopulation, but it's hard to, sort of get a sample, and we don't have enough data on them to even know which questions make the most sense to ask. So here, interviews could be used in a more exploratory way. That's another common use case. And another point, and this is true of, I want to say, qualitative methods in general. sometimes you have a question and there's existing literature, but you may not know all of the sort of responses. So we know there are, say, differences in, patterns of growing older, but we don't know all the nuances. And something like interviews or ethnography, the idea is that even if you don't know that you're trying to ask, from 1 to 5, how would you rate this thing? You're trying to understand what people see as important, what's sort of challenging to them, and you might not have existing measures. A qualitative study allows you to do that. Importantly, for interviews, you could also triangulate with other data types, and interviews have been used, quite effectively alongside survey research to connect narratives to broader patterns. They've been used alongside field observations to connect how people behave in public interactions with how people make sense of those. We also use them to test survey instruments or sort of field methods. So really a lot of use for mixed methods. And there's various ways of combining that, but they fit really well for a lot of different approaches. Some additional strengths. So again, these are things, which of these resonate with you? Probably going to depend in part on your field and your audience. But one thing is you get to hear people's own words, right? So this is true in ethnography. It's also true in focus groups. But here you're having a one-on-one conversation in a setting where you are explicitly, making the person feel comfortable and trying to get them to elaborate. And it allows them to sort of say what, they think is important without worrying as much about, how others around, and in a group setting might judge them, which could also be a useful thing to leverage, something we'll talk about a little bit in group interviews. But the idea is you're getting people's own words. The answers, again, not predetermined. There are lots of variants. So interview studies, like even in my own studies, I've done projects that range from like 10 interviews for a pilot study to hundreds of interviews for, large funded projects. And interviews, work very well at different scales. And another point, and this I want to say could be both a strength and a bit of a weakness, is they're comparatively efficient. And what I mean by this is compared to something like participant observation, where you're spending, hundreds or thousands of hours, following people around. In-depth interviews, you could very, efficiently find people to talk to. An interview is usually between a half an hour and 2 hours. I try to aim to keep mine at about an hour. So you could generate a fair amount of data pretty quickly a lot of the time, and it doesn't necessarily have the same cost associated with building a nationally representative survey. The downside is because there's kind of low startup, or this is one methodologically maybe is a little bit of a downside. People sometimes don't put in, not all of you, but put in the effort to really trying to understand the method and do it well. So it could be what's sometimes people refer to as a cameo method. I'm doing a large survey, but I'm going to tack on some in-depth interviews just to have some sort of flavor text. And then that, could be, both points to the utility and the efficiency of the method, but also a potential downside in that there's a lot of ways to, not implement it well. And I already talked about the combining with other methods. Very common to combine with both surveys or field observations. Okay. Pause for a second. So this is one point that I think is really important to understand, especially for people that are coming from, more quantitative disciplines or, quantitative backgrounds. Now, there's a lot of variation in quantitative methods, and I have always found that interesting and exciting. But I remember a few years ago, I was having a conversation with the editor of Sociological Methodology, and it was still, somebody really kind of well positioned in methods, involved in these debates, and they just did not get the extent of, I want to say, disagreement. Yeah, disagreement, like the range of different ways qualitative work is used. So there's I have an edited volume on this with my colleague, former student Neil Gong. But basically, within even something like ethnography, you have approaches that range from very inductive, grounded theory, go out, you see what emerges, to approaches that are trying to get at understanding sequences of causality. And then you have approaches that are humanist, that are giving voice, but are not trying to adhere to principles of science. And then you have scientific approaches where qualitative methods, contribute, but do something differently than quantitative research. The classic division was, building versus testing hypotheses. And so one thing that's really important when you're doing these methods is to clarify what you're trying to do. So this has a couple points. One is you don't want you want people to be able to understand how and why this makes sense. And then the other aspect of this is you don't want to be evaluated or judged using a logic that doesn't map on to your study. So and that is a real challenge, again, because these are used in a variety of different ways. So there's lots you could read about that. Here's a really sort of simple example. So if, in the health sciences, public health, et cetera, my colleague, Catherine Rendell, did this piece, I'm a contributor to it, where we say, look, it's in response to BMJ saying qualitative work, is not as useful because it doesn't do X, it only is exploratory. The reality is we do use qualitative work exploratory, but it's also used to explain things and answer, all sorts of different questions. So, in our response, and of course, we're drawing on a large, literature here. It's not like we came up with this idea. Sometimes these methods and interviews in particular could be used in an exploratory way. So say a novel topic somewhere where there's not much data. So, you're just trying to get some ideas to scale this. Sometimes the, research is going to be used in a descriptive way to explain how people think in a particular group or setting or set of circumstances. And sometimes this is used in a way that is broader and more comparative. So, the end game, I'm looking at, socioeconomic, racial, and gender differences and experiences in later life. I've worked on NIH studies that look at various trajectories through early phase clinical trials and experiences with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And those types of studies are not exploratory. They're engaging with large extant literatures, have complex sampling schemes, and so it would be inappropriate to evaluate them on exploratory standards, just like an exploratory study with a hard to reach population wouldn't adhere to the same, standards as a large comparative study. And so the point here is there's a lot of variation in terms of qualitative interview studies. And that's something that you want to account for in your design, and also to recognize when you're writing things up, right? So you want to be clear about your approach and the scope of what you're trying to do. And part of how I think of this, so there's an underlying methodological debate about, what are the limits of asking people and producing accounts. But another way to look at this is, for all the talk about theorizing qualitative research, all research has practical considerations and constraints. And this is something that I've always encouraged people to think about, not because everything you do should be determined by constraint, but because recognizing the circumstances in which we're in, sort of, helps at least identify what is feasible in the course of a given study. So these are things that I ask often when I'm talking to PhD students about their dissertations. People have grand ideas, but then there's realities about funding, time to degree, how much time you could reasonably spend on a project. And that's true in industry, it's true in funded health research. You never get an infinite amount of time or resources to do a project. So the way that I think about it, I look at what is the timeline, right? In R01 in health, you get 4 or 5 years. Do I have a team or am I solo researcher? That's going to affect things like the number of interviews that I could do, how I can go about indexing my data, what is the level of familiarity or expertise. And some of this deals with the interviews themselves, right? So some types of interviews, like end of life discussions, those are really hard, especially they're hard for anybody, but they're hard if you are a novice researcher dealing with, some populations or groups. If you're just coming in as an outsider, you haven't sort of put in time to contribute to the community or establish credibility, that, could be a form of expertise or familiarity that's really important. So there's the method side. How do you handle difficult, interviews and whatnot? And we'll talk about some of that. And then there's also expertise with the population. And if you're working on a team, this is something you could consider in terms of, composition and building out a group to execute a larger project. But it's also something worth considering as an individual researcher. So, there are some projects that I'm just not equipped, even as a veteran interviewer, participant observer, that I'm not going to be the best person to do that project. And that's okay. But it's something that I definitely consider. Then there's a question of funding. And this is, again, people sometimes like, well, it shouldn't matter. That's, probably true, but practically it does matter. So how much money you could spend on equipment. Now, the upside of this is you could do an interview study without a ton of money. It's just but you're replacing essentially money with time. So the idea is that there's some cost, but whether or not I have funding available affects equipment, whether I could give participants incentives for participating. That's very similar to a survey or a field study. So, can I give people a $25 gift card as a thank you for their time? I always try to indicate if I'm doing that. I think this is not to say this is all your time is worth, especially with, people that are ill or dealing with end of life things. But it's a small thank you so it's an incentive rather than just compensation. But it does help, recruiting people. Transcription. I don't really love doing transcription myself. I try to avoid it at I don't want to say any cost, but it's really time consuming and painful relative to paying somebody to do that. But whether or not I could do that's going to depend on things like my career stage, right? And so I'm going to have to sort of factor that in. And if I have to transcribe interviews, and it takes me about 5 hours of typing for each hour of audio, that means an interview now takes a 1 hour interview, takes 6 hours of my time, as opposed to, say, an hour and a half, given that, 30 minutes to prepare the audio, send it off, and bring the transcript back in. So these are going to be constraints that ultimately are going to limit which variants of a project are worthwhile. So again, population relationships. Geographical location is something that's a factor too. So it's always easier, or I should say a lot of times it's easier if you could also be on the ground. And but we are where we are, and we may or may not have funding to fly around and talk to people. Now, this is changing a bit in that more people are becoming familiar with remote technologies. I'll talk about that a little bit. So I want to say geographical location is less of an issue now than it was 20 years ago, but there is still, especially if I'm dealing with a hard to reach population, it's going to be easier if I could go develop ties, meet people, sort of show that I'm respectful, I'm interested in learning from them, etc., than if I'm just sort of mass emailing over listservs. And then, of course, the state of existing research. And here, this gets to some of these broader issues about research paradigms and the field. It would probably, for some fields where qualitative methods are new, they might have a sort of narrower position on what interviews could do than a field like sociology, which has always kind of been integrated with qualitative and quantitative methods, where interviews are used for a whole range of different types of projects, everything from, sharing people's experiences and voices to understanding, the very fundamental ways culture and understandings are connected to behavior. That might be a much harder sell, or harder to justify in a different field, and that itself becomes a limitation because it limits whether or not you can win funding for a particular approach, and it limits whether or not it's going to be published in the journals or presses that you care about. So this is how I connect all of that. So I say this, I had this discussion with my advanced grad methods class. The idea is not to be overwhelmed by the constraints. It's to recognize that at the intersection of kind of like the resources that we have, right, which are, our time, our intellectual resources, curiosity, as well as money and things of that nature, and our goals. And for me, the goal is always to maximize insight. So the idea is I would be using interviews because I think it's going to produce an insight that I'm not going to produce with another method. And that's always my sort of use case. It may be different for you. It could be that you have to include a qualitative aim on a grant. It could be you're trying to, develop proficiency in a method. There's lots of good, goals that are not the same as mine. And then between those is the intersection of feasible design. So basically, given all these sorts of constraints, what is reasonable, and what is doable? And that's something you kind of have to, figure out for each project. And again, for me, time is often one of the biggest constraints. So that I think is sort of a shared issue. So some general tips on this, and then we're going to start getting into some more examples and the specifics as we walk through, things like how to construct a sample and how to design interview questions. I find these really, fun topics to go through. So hopefully you find, something interesting and useful. So for me, a compelling design, and these are criteria I use whenever I'm reviewing something, whether it is, like a colleague's paper, student's dissertation, a grant, a book, I ask, does the study leverage the strength of the data in a way that can, produce insights? So at the level of project design, you still don't know. So you could have a really well-designed study, but that doesn't guarantee that it's going to produce something useful. But you look at whether or not it's sort of maximizing the potential to do that. And so I'm going to look at whether or not this sort of maps on the use of interviews to what interviews are good at. So I'm a pretty, I want to say like open reviewer. So if you say I'm using these to give people voice, I'm like, that's a use. If you say I'm trying to understand how people justify decisions that other people find questionable. So I did a study on, sort of risk-taking and health among middle-class cage fighters many years ago. And that was one of the things we used interviews for. Everybody thought this was a sort of crazy activity for a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher to do. And they said, no, this is why it's sort of important. So getting at their justifications, right? It's something that would be harder to do with a different method. So I'm always going to look at that as part of compelling design. Does it speak to both, things that are already out there in the literature? So with interviews, you already have questions. So even if you're trying to build up and, sort of use grounded theory to get at, sort of novel patterns, there is a topic that you're engaging with, you're setting, a sort of case that you're interested in. And, in the case, like, let's go to the cage fighting example. That's what they used to call mixed martial arts before it was a sort of really sportive type of thing. Some of the explanations dealt with these are just violent people. Others dealt with, this is gender domination. That's what it's really about. And so in designing the interview guide, I wanted to see what people actually said, but I also wanted to see if these sort of issues came up. So you're dealing with both expectations of what might explain something as well as what emerges. And that combination is very standard across even the most, I want to say, sort of traditional science-oriented qualitative approaches. Paying attention to unexpected and emerging findings is really important. So if that's not in a research design, I'm going to ding it. And then the other aspect is there a plan to convey these insights to the target audience? So some of this is at the level of writing. So making sure that the reader understands the context that you're speaking about, but even at the level of, say, a proposal, how is that translation going to happen? The other part of this is manageable protocols. So there's always huge debates about sampling, but the question of how many cases or how many interviews do I need? Is there like a simple calculation? The short answer is not really. I mean, there are, but not universally accepted. And so I'll talk about that. But when I'm talking about like linking goals, resources, and designs, I start with working backwards and I look at how much time, it will take me to do a series of tasks for a project or for my team. And that's going to determine the upper limit on how many people I could interview. So I could say I want to interview 400 people for an unfunded project. I want to have, regional variation in addition to race, class, gender, occupation, but it's not doable with my resources. And then the other aspect of this is how hard do I expect it to be to recruit a population? So if I'm talking, sort of working age adults, that's a pretty broad population. I want to make sure that I have important coverage and variation. If I'm talking about intravenous drug users in a rural setting, there might not be that many people in the whole population that meet those criteria, and they might be more reticent to speak to me. And so I try to, start with that and say, how many people, given that I have 6 months to do an exploratory study, can I actually interview? And then the other part of this is with all time trade-offs, that time that I'm spending interviewing is also going to be time that I'm not writing or teaching or other things. So thinking about what is manageable given your resources and working backwards is one way of addressing this pragmatically. This also translates into things like executable procedures. If I need to do a really in-depth analysis of language at, say, the level of words, so I'm, an ethnomethodologist in sociology or, sort of cognitivist, then it's going to take more time to go through an interview than a typical sociology or health policy analysis where you're sort of looking at themes and narratives, but not, how long somebody pauses between, the primary and subordinate clause in a sentence. So that is something, if you have a very specialized approach, you have to consider. And then, of course, one of the things that actually expands your ability to either go larger or have more depth is having a good system for organizing and tracking everything from subjects to resources to data, which is something that I'm going to talk about. And I think there'll be some, really useful tips for everyone on that. But I always try to, think of it in these terms. There are some limits on what we can actually do. And then the goal is to really, for me at least, maximize the insights given those limits, and thinking about, what the limits are and being a little bit conservative on that, in the sense that I would rather find out that, oh, I actually have extra money and time to do some more interviews than not hit a necessary target. And so I guess kind of like the tip here is, when you're thinking about how many interviews you could do, I kind of have like a couple different levels. I have what I think I could really do. And hopefully that's going to correspond to what I put in, say, a proposal, but sometimes not exactly. And then there's also, when we deal with institutional review boards, that's the only point I say I actually want to do more interviews, because if you don't reach that target, then nothing happens. Whereas if you exceed a target, then you have to file an addendum and have like additional review. But all of this starts with getting kind of an accurate estimate of what you could actually do in a given project. Now, some examples of this. So in my own studies, right, I've used interviews, and this part of the point of walking through this is that interviews could be used for different things. And so if you have a small exploratory study and you're like, why would I want to do 4 regions and look at this variation and do like language and that? It's maybe that there's no point in doing those things for your study. So I'm not a sort of one size fits all type person or instructor. And these are just examples where interviews have contributed to projects at various scopes, right? I did one project, I want to say around like probably 20 interviews, that was looking at, sort of treatment and subjects' understandings of new treatments for new agents to treat cancer. The idea is we're just trying to get some, sort of perspectives, some initial data for a larger study. So the idea wasn't to have a complex, systematic, multi-level sample with deep analysis because that would have been not a good investment of time or energy, both for us or our subjects, given where we were trying to go. I still consider that an effective use because it provided some insights that helped us put together a grant. The end game, first book, multi-method study. It was about 2,500 hours of participant observation. I consider that the primary method, but I also did around 60 in-depth interviews, which is kind of like a mid-sized interview component in my field. And they added something that the other methods didn't, which is understanding not only people's life trajectories, which is harder to get systematically when you are following people about their everyday lives, and to understand how they saw not only their own behaviors, but the behavior of others, right? So how they frame that. And then I've worked on large team studies where we really are concerned in looking at comparisons across large groups, looking also at variation within groups, because you want this to reflect what's actually going on in the data. The patient deliberation study was a multi-method study that I did with some colleagues at UCSF that had, close to 200 interviews. And now there's even, I want to say a growing genre of research that might be called large qualitative data sets that involve things like thousands of in-depth interviews. The American Voices Project is an example of that. I was not involved in the design, but I've done some work with the data. And so the point is, and kind of that like the high and low ends, there's debates about the utility, but interviews are very, very scalable in that you could see things that are potentially useful even with a small sample, even if that is not meant to or possibly generalizable, but there are aspects of them, much like a survey, that can be, if you have funding, time, et cetera, include larger populations. So, that's a bit trickier with field methods. So I want to say they're very flexible, which is one of the sort of key points.